Restoration Passion, Panzer IV, Ausf Model H, made by Volmag.
This round is specifically built for this or the Sturmgeschütz. This tank has original mechanisms that mount the MG34 both in the ball gun and the coax gun up on the tank.
First off, I've never seen a bow gun that has an assisted gunner's telescope.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a good amount of room in there for 4 guys in their kit. I can tell you now, it's got more room than some tanks.
Verteilt euch! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke. Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz. Gehen Sie in Abwehrstellung, bis wir wissen, wie viele es sind. Schicken Sie uns einen MG-42-Trupp.
So looking at the H version, right, and J's, the later ones, it has a 80 millimeter face plate here. So this was good, strong 80 millimeter thick armor. The face plate of the Aufbau is 80 millimeters. We're at 50 millimeters on the face of the turret. So this is all to be able to take a shot. The sides were 30 millimeter, which is comparable with the Panzer IIIs. And then, as crazy as it is, the tail of the Panzer IV is 20 millimeter, which is roughly 3/4 of an inch. So Panzer IV from the rear is, you don't want to be on the receiving end of anything that's shot at it from the rear. If you see, a lot of the Panzer IVs were killed and penetrated on this glacis piece here that runs up. So this area right here is all 20 millimeter armor. So if a round comes in here, yay, 80 millimeter armor. If the round comes in here, 20 millimeter armor. Not good.
So does that 20 millimeter provide any sort of ricochet angle, or does it generally straight through or straight into?
I would not want to be on the other end of that.
Okay.
with a 76 millimeter round coming at a high velocity. It's not even going to know that this exists. It's going to go straight through.
Yep.
This center plate right here is removable by these screws, and so you take this out, and that's how they would access the drive components. The differential and the transmission could all come out here. Back to here, good hit. It can take a hit, and then on the turret face, probably could take a pretty good shot too.
Okay, and I see some crew serviceability features, like we've got the access panels for all of your transmission and steering, and then we can do track work with the liftable fenders too.
Yeah,
so.
we got spring-loaded fenders here. So these are brake service hatches. So you would reach inside, undo the deal, and this lean pulls out. And underneath there, you see the braking system of the Panzer IV. Perhaps we'll see it inside later. It's a big drum that has big band brakes on it, and then that runs a shaft that goes into the final drive that's actually driving the drive sprockets. And so the Panzer IV is steered by a reduction of gear ratio. So when you pull the tiller, the bands will grab the drum, which runs the shaft and makes some magic happen inside of the gear part of the final drive, and it'll drop a gear ratio. So you have a 1-to-1 gear ratio on one side and a 1-to-2 ratio on the other side. I'm not sure about the 1-to-2, but a reduced ratio. And so that would tend to make the tank make a turn. If you pulled further back on the tiller, then it would completely lock up one side, and then you would have a hard steer. So it's similar to the Russian tanks of the time, where you're not steering the tank by brake friction that causes resistance on one side that makes it want to drift and turn. This is actually, you pull it back, it triggers gear reduction, and then the tank will turn. So that's what these brake hatches are about. It's interesting that if you see destroyed Panzer IVs, these are always coughed open. So again, my theory is that if there was an internal explosion, there's only one catch that holds these things down. So they're gonna cough open. Hatches are gonna go in all the different directions. So
okay, and then the track the track stowage, is this indicative of all Panzers, or did they kind of upgrade to more stowage spots?
I think the very early tanks. I'm not sure when this became a factory standard. This was applied in the field a lot. It eventually became a factory option as they were issued out of the factory with these many links in the front. This goes way back. These links here. You will also see kind of a somewhat misconception is that if you strap on tracks onto your tank, that you're going to increase the armor. But truly, they might help a little, but it's not a good first go-to. But you would see the crews, they would strap strap track sections onto the sides here. It's very common to see field application of tracks here, over there on the turret face, and that's all again to try to put as much armor between you and your enemy as possible.
That's just a blackout light, or did they do white light as well? What's that?
This could act both ways. So the earlier versions had the no-tech light, and that's the little shielded light. And the idea is that if you're in at night and you're cruising around, the driver needs to be able to see, but you don't want to have much light so that the enemy can see you. So those lights would tend to just cast a little bit of light right down in front of the tank, just enough that the driver can see. So then later they went to, and I'm going to guess 43-ish time frame, they went to the Bosch light and did away with the no-tech light. But then if you're running in a safe area, this will remove, and then you kind of got the whole headlight.
Okay.
On the back side here, it's all limited down where light can't pass straight through. It has to go through a little deflector and thing, and again, it's going to throw just a little shadow of light right in front of the tank.
And if you can take a second to talk about branding with the Germans, a lot of the World War II guys out there, they all know the story with the Willys Jeep and Ford and putting the logos in the scripts, and they had to do away with that. So it wasn't seen that during wartime we were favoring one company over another. But you look right on that thing and you can see Bosch like stamped right in there.
The political system in Germany of the time was heavy with favoritism and who's buddies with who. So there would be certain companies that gets the contract to do something, and they just made, Krupp and Bosch and stuff like that. They didn't hide their name. They were the makers of that piece. This is a reproduction piece. I have an identical original to it, but it's not on the tank because it would be out here getting beat up.
Right.
So this is a placeholder.
No, that's a great reproduction.
Yeah,
you got fooled me. Yeah. And then move along to we haven't talked about yet, just crew. How many crew we got and where are they at, real quick? Yeah.
So 5 guys fit in this. It was you and 4 of your closest friends. You had a driver that would be looking at this. You'd have a radioman and machine gunner, and he was referred to as the Funker. So that's Funk is German for radio. So the Funker sat in here, driver here. The gunner operated on the left side of the tank and had this vision port here that he could see out of. This was kind of a transitionary period of that particular vision port. Early war there was 2. There was one on either side. And then later in the war they completely did away with it. So right at the time this was made, it was a transition, and those were going away. So,
okay.
A lot of the features you'll see was as production is continuing and changes are made, then all of the subcontractors that are making the pieces, they start producing the newly designed parts. They have to make it to the assembly plant and be incorporated into a tank. So that didn't happen overnight. So when you look at the German equipment, much more than American, it's the dividing lines between the models and what's correct and is not correct is a blurred line. So there was, they could be working out old stockpiles. So you'll see different things that shouldn't show up on a tank. It's like, oh, that's not correct. Well, that's the way it was made.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see like a lot of folding hatches and armor plates. Like, does this all move down and reduce itself, or that's what he's got essentially?
No, this outer shield here is pretty thick. I'm not sure on the center section, but it had to be, somewhere between 50 and 80 millimeters of armor. But there's controls on the inside that we'll see later, where you could open this up and close this hatch. And there was multiple settings, so you could close it down where you could barely see out of it, or kind of see out a little, or it could be wide open like this.
And then crew access, I can see these two hatches here. And then you had, basically from what I can see already, like each crew member has his own access point. So were they predicting that they were going to be bailing out and they just made that in there? Or
I bet they were glad that it was
yeah,
that it worked out that way. Yeah, that's a kind of the Panzer IV is hatch rich compared to some of the other tanks.
But that brings up an interesting point. The more voids you put in the armor plate, it weakens the integrity of the armor. So did we see that kind of change, or were the hatches more or less carried right through to the end of Panzer?
Again, this is a 1930s idea.
So they didn't predict that.
Went through 45.
Right.
So I'm sure in 44 they said, "Dang, I wish we didn't have these weak spots," or I wish we'd have done it different." But too late.
Yep. Okay.
The very early Panzer IVs actually had an offset so that it was not one straight plate here. The driver is kind of set forward of the radioman, and it had a little tiny hatch on the side so the driver could actually have peripheral vision. He had vision ports here, a straight ahead, and one out the side. But pretty quickly they went to a monolithic front face.
Okay. Now everyone asked the concrete looking stuff on the front here. Talk about that for a second.
Okay. So this treatment is called Zimmerit, and at a point in the war they became very worried about magnetic shape charges that could be stuck onto the tank with a magnet, like the sticky bomb, right? So the idea of this is an anti-magnetic paste with a very, very rough texture, and that way if your enemy ran up and he placed a magnetic mine on your tank, it's just going to fall off. It won't stick. When it came out, they would Zimmerit everything. And then as the war went on, they continued to use less and less and less Zimmerit. Different factories applied different patterns. So the pattern that is here is one that would have come out of WOMAG in the time frame, the December-January time frame that we're talking about.
And so that brings up a good point. The crew didn't apply this. This was done by the factories. That came out factory standard.
Early was done in the field because they retrofitted a lot of tanks, and that's when you really see some crazy Zimmerit. I mean, they had Zimmerit everything in weird patterns. And then it became formally adopted into the manufacturing process, and that's when you start seeing it standardized. Okay. And then eventually it went away. They completely discontinued it.
All right. Is there anything else on the front of the tank without going into crazy level?
I want to talk about this hinge.
Okay. Stay tuned for part 19 where we talk about
this hinge.
Part 19. So here we are at the right-hand side of the tank, and yeah, just give us an overview of what we're looking at.
Okay, you're looking at a combination of original steel and new steel. So for a common person to go out and buy the components that I talked about earlier, what you wind up with is bits and pieces. And so when you put this all together into the end result, then it doesn't all fit. So this is a combination of original armor and new made armor. Using the original armor kept us on task for keeping our dimensions straight. So if you're putting together a puzzle and you're missing one piece of that puzzle, you can't just put any size piece in there. It has to be the right size piece or it doesn't work. So we found that as we was moving through this, mixing new construction steel with old World War II steel, that it kept us on task. It had to be the right dimensions or it didn't fit together.
Okay. And let's start from the bottom and work our way up. What can you tell us about the track itself and any issues they might have had or upgrades and so on and so forth?
Okay. The early World War II German track, this track is standard to Panzer III, Panzer IV, and all the sub-variants there. So this was a standard track. It was a good track, no problem, I guess. It's a dry pin steel, so the pin is the only thing holding it together. There's no bearings or lubrication or anything. It's just metal on metal. It would wear, and they would have to constantly be reproducing it. There was a early war. There was a narrower track, and this is the later late war track. And this is a giveaway on the late war track because the guides are solid, and most of the track of the time is hollow. They tried to make it as light as possible. This is a late war style, later than the tank actually.
So talk about the road wheels and the bogies and how that kind of works.
Okay.
Yeah.
The bogies didn't change from the first Panzer IV that rolled out to the last Panzer IV that rolled out. As I said before, it can take unbelievable weight. It's simple to replace. You take the bolts out, you throw another one in. These pieces are cast pieces, so there would be some standardization in those. So as long as you've got the right bolt pattern in your hull, you could take another one. If you lost one from a mine, then you could jack your tank up, you could put a replacement. There's photos of where they would carry spares of these, like up on the rear deck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you'd see these bogie assemblies. Very much like a Sherman.
Yeah.
But super resilient, rough, but it's a good, a bulletproof.
So it looks like, I've never seen a tank with this type of suspension, kind of like a leaf spring type of a setup. Like,
yeah, both of these, the tires they work together on two little swing arms off of a center point, and they will pivot against one another, and then also the whole assembly can rotate. So as long as it didn't need to move too much in terms of the suspension, it would follow the ground and provide the vibration control that they needed.
Yeah. And I see no rubber like on the top return rollers. That's steel on steel. That's crazy.
Yeah. I think by the time they implemented the all steel return rollers, they were figuring out that these things weren't lasting a long time. So steel on steel in a modern army, a peacetime army, big deal. Don't do it.
Yeah.
You want things to last. But when things are rolling out here, if it survives 9 months, you're doing good, right? So at some point, to save rubber, they went to all steel.
And have you guys found that when you're driving this thing, you can hear them squeaking and moving? Or
oh yeah, this you hear stories of vets that would say you could hear the Germans coming for a long ways, and it is a noisy. This track is clanking, the steel on steel, the drive sprockets are clicking, and so there is a lot of sound coming out of this.
The one thing that I would comment on this tank is, again, the detail. When you glance your eyes across this thing, there's so much to look at. And one of the things I notice is probably a good idea as an attempt to save steel, but a lot of your Pioneer tools and CES servicing equipment, it's all exposed in a series of brackets rather than in storage bins. But I look at some of this stuff, I don't even know what it does. So if you can take a second to go through the equipment on the sides here.
Okay, so we start out with an axe. That's for chopping stuff.
Yep.
This little hook here will split, and there's a pry bar or a tanker bar that will fit into this, and it's for pulling the track when you're changing the track. The fender would flip back, that'll hook into the track, and through the use of this pry bar, you can tension your track.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a remote start handle. So you had your electric starter, which would start your engine normally, but if you had bad batteries, if you're in Russia and it's 20 below zero and your batteries are crap, then you'd have to inertia start it. So that handle fits in a hole in the back, and the guys would spin this thing and get inertia going, counterweights inside, and once they got that weight spinning at a certain speed, there's carrying all that start energy, and then the guy on the inside could flip a switch and it would start the motor.
That's an interesting concept. A lot of guys associate that with old, World War II Jeeps and T-model Fords where you're actually turning the engine, but you mentioned counterweights. The inertia starter for this, is that a separate component?
It's a separate component.
Like sits outside the engine?
Sits on the Maybach. The engine in this would have been a Maybach HL 120.
Yeah.
TRM was the full designation. So it's a V12 about 750 cubic inches if you do the math.
Yep.
This tank has a 1960s GMC V12.
Okay.
So GMC tried to compete with diesels. They made a V12. Coincidentally, it's roughly the same bore, same stroke, same length, number of cylinders. So it sounds right. It has about the same power. And so it's a great substitute for the $250,000 Maybach.
Okay. And then yeah, moving further down, what have we got? This green thing here.
So yeah, you got this a jack. It's a 10-ton jack, and there's a wood block on the other side. You'd throw down the wood block, hook the jack up under it, and you wouldn't be able to raise the tank, but oftentimes they would dig a hole and then try to release some weight off of one side and kind of trying to make enough room that they could, service the wheels and things like that. So that's just a jack.
So that was purely for road wheel changing, basically.
It's servicing, yeah, just like you would use your spare tire, your spare jack in your car.
Yeah, and then we see more track links here individually. I would imagine, one damaged track, they're going to go to that, but if they lose a whole section, they got the quick change stuff on the front.
Yep.
Okay.
This is one of the designating things from the different models in different periods of times. They came up with different places to locate these tracks. So in Vomag manufacturer during this period, they had 3 links on this side. Later tanks, they had a rod that would come here and they would hang 6 links on the side, right, in 2 layers. A lot of the tanks that you will see photos of, if you look at a lot of black and white photos, you'll see 3 links on the rear. So Vomag never did that. That's a Nijwerk or Nibelungenswerk feature where they put these 3 links. But there was always 3 links there somewhere. And as time went on, they were located in all kinds of different areas. But this particular tank takes them right there.
Okay. And then we've got another tool at the back here. Is that track servicing or what?
Yeah, this is for tensioning the track. Yeah. So it's got the splined head on it, and so that when this track is released and it's slack, then they could maintain their repairs. And then when they tension the track again on the idler adjuster, they take these caps off, and that head slips over the shaft, this cantilevered shaft, and then guys could pull that, and it would pull the track tension back, and then they would set that. So for the Super Panzer IV nerds,
how many of those are there?
There's 7 of us in the world. So the shovel was on this particular tank faced rearwards. Okay. And so Vomag put them on rearwards. Krupp was a manufacturer. They put them on rearwards. The most prolific manufacturer of Panzer IVs was this Nijwerk in Austria, and their shovel was reversed. So if you see a shovel head over here, it's a Nijwerk tank. If you see its back, it could either be Vomag or Krupp.
Any idea why?
No.
All right.
I always figured that these things were assembled by regular dudes, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, there would be a lot of variance as these things are coming out, and they're wanting to get them out the door, and so they're sticking on stuff.
Okay. And then we got an interesting engine setup, but before we get deep into the engine, this is airflow for, is it outboard airflow?
Yeah, so the air in the Panzer IV flows across it. It draws in cool air on the left side, and it pulls it through the radiators, taking the heat out of it. It continues this direction, and it will either exhaust out the top of this door, it has a vent in the top, and it will come out there, or it will come out here. So it's drawing air on those 2 features on that side, and it's expelling air on the features on this side.
Okay.
These flaps are, if you wanted to if it was a cold environment and you wanted to heat your engine up, you could close these flaps that would restrict the airflow in there where your engine would maintain heat.
Okay. All this external looks like sheet metal. That had a particular name in German, right?
Yep.
So,
German is Schürzen.
Schürzen.
The skirting is how it translates. So the purpose for the Schürzen, and Germans were big believers in Schürzen. You see that on most of their tanks. And that was, its intention was to set off shape charge rounds or anti-tank rifles. So if you could take the energy out of the projectile that's coming in to get you, if you could take a bunch of energy out of it or thwart it by using this thin skirting, then you're going to keep that contact off of the vehicle itself. So the idea was like, for instance, a Piat or a bazooka or handheld devices, there was all kinds of things they'd throw that would be shape charged. If it hit the Schürzen, it's going to ignite the shape charge, and then the blast will go basically nowhere. If it contacted the tank, it could penetrate the tank and go in and kill the crew.
So it's kind of like a cheaper, somewhat effective, like a survival chance.
It serves exactly the same purpose as modern conflict today. With U.S. vehicles, will have the screens and the mesh on the side.
Yep.
Those are to primarily stop like RPGs coming in.
Right.
So whatever's coming in is going to hit those, expend its energy, and be safe.
And that has something to do with all this bracketry here as well.
Yep. This is a hanger system for big shirts and plates that fit over the side, and that's when you look at the photos of Panzer IVs, oftentimes you'll see them it'll just be a smooth wall of plating on the side. So this is the hangers that they hang them off of. I don't have them on because I want to show off the work, and otherwise you're just going to see a bunch of steel plates, right?
Right.
So one plate would be about this wide. It would hang over these two triangles here, and also catch this. And they would hang in at a slight in angle.
Okay.
Come right down to the wheels.
Oh wow, that's a big plate. Okay, and then I see some battle damage and stuff going on on the shirts in there as well.
There's a couple worth bearing mentioning. So you see a lot of rust pitting. That's kind of, for obvious reasons, where this was in the ground somewhere.
Yeah.
A lot of our shirts, and when we built this tank, were completely bent. I mean, they were like completely out of shape. But we have a 100-ton press. We put these in with putting some heat on it and some 100 tons. We could work with this stuff and make it straight. We've had several pieces of battle damage on all the different parts. Most of the parts we used were destroyed, and so everything had a death to it. And some of the evidence of those deaths are left there. That's probably a fragmentation. So an artillery round went off or something, and a piece of fragmentation went up there. This is a super interesting one here. So I measured these holes. They're roughly 12.5 millimeter, which would be like a 50 caliber or a Deshika.
Okay.
And so on the inside of the Scherzen, you have the turret opening, and quite often I would imagine that they were cruising around with their inner doors open, so they could get some ventilation and whatnot. And just for good safety or whatever, you could close the outer doors and kind of feel safe. But you can see here there's 3 targeted shots that are headed directly for that open door.
That's crazy.
So yeah, somebody was trying to kill somebody when those holes.
Wow. So that right there tells a story of some kind, and there's more details out there somewhere, or maybe not.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of battle damage on the face of this, but when we put on the Zimmer, we covered it all up. So.
Okay. Touch on paint scheme and kind of the markings and what those markings there denote.
Okay, so the German armor started out Panzer Gray. So that early war, there was all that. It's somewhere in late 42, 43, I think. Anyway, they switched and they started producing all of the German armor. Came out with this yellow color. The yellow color kind of shifted as the war went out, but basically it was the same.
Was that yellow something to do with the Afrika Korps particularly, or?
Afrika Korps was kind of a different thing. When the tanks that went to Africa, they were still painting things Panzer Gray.
Okay.
So in Africa, you have these really dark spots out there. So they would paint them with any light color that they could.
Right.
So there's a color called Ordnance Tan that was common in the German army, where it was just a general paint, and it was kind of a cream color like that. So they get their hands on that color and overpaint their gray. So the early war tanks, you see Panzer Gray base,
right,
and then you see the Ordnance Tan on top.
So the Ordnance Tan, is that a different tan to this one?
It's a little different. It's a little more clay-like, clay color, I guess. This is kind of yellow-green-ish. And as I said, the color shifted. So the early, it's called Dunkelgelb, or variations of that.
Yep.
So early on, it's a lot greener, and then as it got later in the war, it became like the last Panzer IVs that rolled out. It was almost pale yellow.
Right.
It got lighter and lighter and lighter.
Okay. And then the markings like that. What Panzer unit or division would this be right now?
Well, to tend to leave the tanks that I do kind of generic, unless there's a reason to put a divisional insignia on it. It kind of, if you're really into it, then a division will dedicate the vehicle to like a specific theater and a specific time.
Okay.
So I basically generic.
Yep.
231 is 3 numbers that I liked, so
Okay.
I thought they would look good on there.
Yeah.
They painted these numbers on in many different styles. So a lot of again, there's a misconception that German tanks should all have the red letters with the white outfly. Well, that was prevalent in Normandy, so we kind of channel everything into that and say, oh, it's all that way.
Yeah.
But letters were done with different colors, different shapes, big, little, hollow, stencil type letters or whatever. So this is just one that I chose. This is kind of maybe representative of something off the Eastern Front, kind of about this war time period. Right. Although you could see this in Normandy or right into the battle for Berlin, and it's all appropriate for that.
Now, in terms of camouflage, you hear all kinds of stories about guys brush painting them on, putting it on with a mop. This looks like it's spray painted on. I know there is footage of them spray painting. Was there like anything that would dictate what was to be done? Or you mentioned something earlier about unit commanders telling the crews that the tank's got to be this way, or like...
Yeah, this is another area that there's no correct answer for, really.
Right.
I mentioned the Panzer Gray. At that time, it was field expediency, right? So they're hanging bed sheets in the winter, and using whitewash or whatever they can find. And then about the time they went to Dunkelgelb, they would be issued 2 other colors, this red, brown, and the green. They came out in buckets.
Okay.
And so they would say, camouflage your tank to match the terrain. So that was tasked to the division or the regiments or battalion, platoon, right down to the individual tank. And how that was handled was different throughout the theaters and time frame. So what you get is like whatever you can imagine for a paint scheme that is with the red and the green and the yellow, it's probably was done.
Okay. So that kind of explains, when you flick through books and models and different pictures, foremost before anyone, the Germans, you see such a variety of different camouflage patterns. That kind of hits the nail on the head as to why that was.
Truly every tank was unique. It was an expression of the guy that was painting it.
Okay.
And it was brushed on, it was mopped on.
Yep.
But there's some that's pretty standardized, where, like, say if there was a company commander and he said, I want you guys to paint your tanks and I want it to look like this.
Right.
Then they would all go out and try to paint their tanks like that.
Okay.
Other cases that say, here's some paint, go camouflage your tank, and then it would come out entirely differently.
Now, talk about the Germans with things like nose art and the crew like individualizing a tank with graffiti, and that was done with the Allies quite a lot. Was that a thing with Germans as well, or not really? In
my observation, probably, but not much.
Okay.
I think German army is a pretty disciplined army. Pretty much all the way through.
Yeah.
And stuff like that really probably wasn't tolerated too much.
Okay.
The two types of customization that you will see is guys would paint their girl's name on it. So there's some famous photos of different tanks that have Erica was the big name, right? So Erica's written, or Paula, or whatever the girl's name was. The other one that perhaps was condoned was like if a tank lost a crew member, then there was a certain little death notice that went out in the newspapers in Germany.
Right.
And so they would use that, it's like a little iron cross, and they would paint that on the tank, and then they would put their fallen crew member's name on it, and then the dates when he was killed.
Okay.
So sometimes you'll see the tanks like up on the front or on the side or somewhere, you'll see these little crosses with dates on them and stuff, and that's fallen crew members from that tank.
And what about kill count, like the rings on the barrel? I know you do see that quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't know about quite a bit. So like real fit, like the Tigers, they're all famous, right? So Whitman, he's got all the stripes up and stuff.
Yeah.
If you look at just Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, all these other tanks, you really don't see it that much.
Okay.
You would see trends in styles, whether it's early war, whether it's Eastern Front, Western Front, mid, late. They eventually did come up like the last manufacturer of Panzer IVs was Nywerk.
Okay.
And they actually had a factory camo paint job that came out for the last many months of the war. So if it was 1945 and it was a brand new tank, it's going to come from Nywerk and it's going to have a certain look to it because they were painted at the factory.
Cool.